Chris Farfoy.
Mr Chair, and I thank the Minister for her contribution. Mr Chair, there's an episode of The West Wing where the President's Chief Advisor, Leo McGarry, quotes, paraphrases Otto von Bismarck about there are two things that you don't want to be seeing made, and that is laws and sausages. And I think in this instance, this is one of those instances where you wish a war, you didn't see a law like this being put together in this fashion because it has been rushed. And I think the contribution that the Minister has made around an SOP she has just tabled and the SOP my colleague David Parker has tabled is pure evidence that the government is rushing this piece of legislation through and that it should have had time when it first had noticed that this need to address these returning offenders and returning prisoners should have been addressed at the beginning of this year. And Mr Chair, I know you want me to speak to part two, so I will talk about it in the context of what is and what is not in this part. What is in this part is some of the easy stuff, and what is not in this part is some of the stuff that, if this were to go through a select committee process, there would have been questions about it. Some of my colleagues have talked about that, and that is some of the services that would help reintegrate some of these returning offenders and returning prisoners, would have helped monitor some of these returning offenders and prisoners. And the easy stuff is in there, and I'll look at an example, and that is clause 13, Mr Chair, and that is an offence to not comply with a constable's direction if they feel that they have to detain you or they want to get information from you about your offending or your convictions overseas. So, Mr Chair, clause 13, pretty simple, the easy stuff is in there. But if we had the opportunity to sit down, Mr Chair, in a select committee, it would have been justice and electoral or law and order, we would have asked, and I think some of the submitters would have asked some pretty basic questions of the government around what do we do with these people when they get here? What kind of support services do we have for them? What do we do around reintegration? It's my understanding that when the government took a snapshot of offenders or those who are convicted that have come back from overseas over the last couple of years, that the reoffending rate of those people was around roughly 20% higher than those who had been released from New Zealand prisons. So we do have an issue because the likelihood of these people coming to our shores, being deported, that their reoffending rate is much higher than those who are released from New Zealand prisons.
I am going to interrupt the member, and I'm going to invite him to now move from a general second reading type debate to a particular discussion in part two.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. And that is around their reoffending. And I guess in relation to David Parker's SOP, which changes clause 9, having more information about their offending and what level of risk that they would pose would be helpful to the government in being able to offer them those kind of reintegration services. And the fact that David Parker had to include or put forward his SOP shows, Mr Chair, the rushed nature and the ill-thought-out nature of this piece of legislation. And for those at home who want to know what Mr Parker's SOP is, it does amend clause 2 around the identifying particulars for people who are deported to New Zealand. And in clause 9 he wants to add the words and the details of any overseas conviction and overseas penalty for any such conviction of the returning offender. Now, you would think that would be one of the basic things in this piece of legislation to know not just who they are, because as it stands we understand the identifying particulars just tell the authorities who this person is, but to get an idea of how much of a risk they may be to the public, because this is what we want to make sure we can mitigate for New Zealanders, and this is what the government claims it is putting this piece of legislation forward for. We want to know exactly what risk profile these guys have, or these women may have to New Zealand public. But in the bill itself, Mr Chair, we don't have the mechanism to be able to find out what they may have done, what they may have been convicted for. So, Mr Parker has seen fit to put forward this SOP to clarify what identifying particulars are. Now, are we surprised that we have had to do this, Mr Chair? Well, no, because within the regulatory impact statement, we find a statement that is becoming all too common, Mr Chair. Mr Chair?
Kelvin Davis.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'd like to